is a great supporter of Russia and the Russian community and the Russian government and Russian foreign policy because he's a supporter of Australia now. Because Australia and Russia have common interests. And I would like to, it is my honor in fact, to hand over the microphone to Dr. Jim Saleam, leader of the Australia First political party.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Timmy. I know there's a saying that there's nothing worse than to be lectured by a history professor. Right, it's very gruelling. And I suppose I am a bit along that way. But something occurred to me this morning when I attended the ceremony down at Waverley Council that I found incredibly disturbing. And it goes something like this. You noticed a number of political leaders like Mr. Sharma, like the member for Bondi, and even the city mayor who spoke at Waverley there, about the victory, they said, of the Soviet Union over Germany in the war. And they talked about a crusade for freedom and our rights and democracy and so forth. When Russia fought Germany between 1941 and 1945, the Russians call it the Great Patriotic War, as we all know, because it was an absolute war, a war fought between two peoples because one people came to ruthlessly dispossess the other. Now, we Australians also know something about Great Patriotic Wars because Australia fought one too. We fought a Great Patriotic War against Japan, also from 1941 to 1945. In that war, there would have been no mercy, no negotiation, no nothing. Someone had to win and someone had to lose. But the people who often talk, and you saw them there in person if you're there today, about democracy and freedom, you remember Mr. Sharma said some lovely words about the victory of Russia in the war, but Mr. Sharma writes foreign policy for the Morrison government. And what is the Morrison government? It is one of the most determined anti-Russia forces in the whole so-called Western world. It's totally dedicated, completely dedicated to the idea that the Russian state represents some sort of moral and political evil. That's what it says. So consequently, when people talk sometimes about freedom and democracy, what do they actually mean? Well, I love that minor anecdote when President Putin a number of years ago was talking with George Bush, the President of the USA, and George Bush was talking about freedom and democracy and extending it through the whole world. And in the end, President Putin lost patience with him. It was absolutely obvious. And he leaned across and he said, "Yeah, George, like in Iraq." Because it was obvious that the system that the USA represents, which they attempt to extend throughout the whole world, is not really democratic. It's not really freedom. It's no such thing. And in fact, on a day like this, I'll sort of close on this remark. We all know that the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. Yes, they did. And we all know that the German army and the other forces of Germany persecuted a number of atrocities and whatnot against the Russian peoples. But one of the most interesting things about it is that this war was partly incited by Britain. In 1944 and 1945, I can't quite remember now, there was a meeting, one of the big three meetings, and Stalin, who was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, passed a comment to Winston Churchill. Yes, we know all about Rudolf Hess. You remember that the second in charge of Germany defected to Britain in 1941 and so on and so forth. And what this was actually about, as documents from Britain now reveal, it was an incredibly intelligent MI6 attempt to convince the Germans that if they actually invaded the Soviet Union, there would be some sort of coup in Britain and some sort of conservative government would come to power which actually would treat with the Germans. Well, we know that Winston Churchill did have no intention of treating with Adolf Hitler or Germany, that much is true. But now what we see is a ruthless attempt to involve the two great European nations in a war which he considered to his own advantage. And remember this, aren't these the people who talk the most about democracy? And they signed the Atlantic Charter, and then they signed the United Nations agreements, and then they've signed all these other agreements again around the world right up to now. And who's the enemy right now? Russia's the enemy. It doesn't matter whether Russia is communist or whether it is liberal democratic, whether it's led by a drunk like Boris Yeltsin who sells off state property, or by Vladimir Putin. For some reason, the system that rules in the United States, Great Britain and the other Western countries is absolutely driven to a confrontation with Russia. Now, speaking as an Australian, I don't speak for Russia. What Russia does is Russia's business. But I do know one thing, Russia's not the enemy of Australia. Never was, never will be, can't. It's just impossible for Russia to be the enemy of Australia. Impossible. And it wouldn't matter whether Vladimir Putin's a good bloke or a bad bloke. And quite frankly, I don't care who interferes with doorknobs or who drinks his Novichok. It's not my business, right? It's a matter of minding our own business. And that's what actually, folks, as I conclude, disturbed me a little bit about that meeting today. The very same people who are honouring the achievements, the great achievements of the Russian army in that hideous war, right, that hideous war, are the very same people who go back to Canberra and they want to put sanctions on Russia.
Yes.
Therefore, there's a double agenda operating here. So it's also fine that the Russian army defeated Adolf Hitler, but who's the fascist today? Vladimir Putin is the fascist. We have to organise against the evil Russia. Russia is up to some diabolical trickery in the world, and the other day they actually said that Russia represents a community of authoritarian powers. So it's time for a new democratic crusade, folks, to get rid of the authoritarian powers. And speaking as an Australian, and to use a great phrase from a very old American movie, quite frankly, my dears, I don't give a damn. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you to Dr. Jim, and I'd just like to say it's a very good outlook, and Mr. John Kaprivniak.